Hello friends, or should I say hola mi amigos? And that's particularly the reason why I don't use that phrase in Spanish, because the reason why we're not using Latin America to cover this region is because it's particularly not useful in the sense that it underplays the role of the French, the Dutch, Asians, and Africans that came to this region to really shape it to become the cultural melting pot in which that Middle and South America is today and what it has been for so much time. So the reason why we don't use Latin America in this sense is particularly for that reason, because of its intense mixture of racial and ethnic differences that have come together in Middle and South America. Pictured here is Panama City in the country of Panama, their capital city. Took this picture a few years back doing some field research down there, and it really does give you the vibe of what they were calling in their sense of their Miami of Middle America. And it was something that a few folks down there told me about. I'm not sure if we'd exactly call it or go as far as that speaking, but as you can see, some of the pictures that come to your mind regarding this region might not fit this imagery here, but it is a vibrant booming area in terms of business and development, as well as some of the other imagery that you would use to describe this region, thinking of the landscape and the environment and the natural environment. So just like in past practice, we're going to begin with part one to walk us through the physical geography and the environment, and before we move on to talking about the human properties regarding Middle and South America. Do not say Latin, which is what I just attempted to do. But let's talk about what this is, because it isn't Latin America. We're calling it this Middle and South America, this clunky term. Why are we calling it that? Well, I said why in terms of the cultural mixture of peoples that exist here in the region today. But when we refer to this Middle and South America, we're referring to a region that includes Mexico, the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. So essentially, when we think of the Western Hemisphere, everything south of the United States and Canada. It's a very large area to cover. We have many, many countries, unlike our two-country region before. This involves an immense diversity of regions, languages, and other different cultural practices, and even different types of colonialization that happened hundreds of years ago. And so we talk about the two regions. We'll talk about Central America as being this isthmus, which is a geographic term in the book. It's essentially an airstrip of land that is joining these two larger land areas, joining what is joining North and South America. Our first major region that we take care of in this a larger region would be that of Mexico, our neighbor to the south. We share 2,000 miles of a border, and the border is a lot of dominating the conversation these days. We talk about it from an immigration standpoint, and the wall, but you certainly have heard of the U.S.-Mexican border to some capacity, dominated by the Rio Grande River, as well as other natural barriers that create a distinction between the United States and Mexico. But nevertheless, what separates our 50 states and some territories between the 31 states of Mexico and their federal district in Mexico City, their capital in the central part of that country. We'll talk a little bit more about Mexico in the sub-region section, but for now it would be important to know in the western part of the country, you have the Sierra Madres. It's a mountain chain that runs through that area, before you have some low-lying areas in the south and near the Gulf of Mexico. From there, we go off of Mexico and Central America, and we move into the Caribbean. Now the Caribbean, again, dominated by a lot of different settlers past. We have colonization here from the French, the Dutch, the British, the Spanish, and some areas that now have given a shape to what we see here. And it's separated by two areas that we would refer to as the Greater Antilles and the Lesser Antilles, and these would be typically relatively intuitive to know that some of the larger islands characterized by a smaller chain of islands out east. Greater Antilles would be countries like Cuba and Jamaica, the island of Hispaniola, which is Haiti and the Dominican Republic that shares that. Now out towards the Atlantic Ocean, but framed within the Caribbean here, the island chain of the Bahamas, and we see here the Caribbean Sea. We don't want to forget about the islands, the small islands that run out to the eastern part of the of the region, and also the Lesser Antilles here, which is also called as the Netherlands Antilles, the ABC Islands, Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao. Islands settled by the Netherlands, or the Dutch, and so a very creative name to characterize those three islands there. And so here we have, again, culturally different areas because of its past history with it being colonized by many different factors, many different countries, and for many different purposes. And we'll talk about those again more further when we dive deeply into the subregions and pull out specific countries to talk about because they may be relevant or interesting to us today. Moving on, we have the Central American region. And Central America is important because it does do that connection between North America and South America. It is our connection here home to the Panama Canal in Panama. Other countries such as Nicaragua and Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Belize, mostly settled by the Spanish here, Belize settled by the British, and Panama has had its differences in terms of those that have been involved there because the United States and the French have been involved there to a small extent due to the Panama Canal and the Panama Canal Zone. It was a massive engineering project that took place in the early 1900s that we'll talk about more in the following slides. But this is an area that separates the Atlantic from the Pacific, the Caribbean to the Pacific Ocean, and it's an area of great importance from a trade perspective as well because of that of Panama, but also a region that's becoming increasingly dependent on U.S. trade and relationships between the United States and elsewhere, but also the United States and this region here. From there we move on to South America. South America in this case it's an entire continent here. Moving on from Central America, you have the entire continent. This continent is dominated by the country of Brazil, which is the 5th largest country in the world in both terms of people and geographic area in size. It's pretty neat that it fits both requirements for 5th largest in both population and in geographic size, something that should be pretty easy to remember. If you remember Russia being number 1, which we didn't cover yet, but the United States being 3 and Canada being 2, here we have number 5 with Brazil. And again, this area dominated by the Andes Mountains that runs through in the western portion of this country. The equator runs through this continent before, not a country. The Andes run through the countries of the western part of the continent, followed by a lowland area, the Amazon basin, the Amazon rainforest. We have highlands, the Guiana highlands and the Brazilian highlands. We also have an area known as the Pampas and Patagonia, which are different geographic regions down below there that I'll characterize with a few pictures to follow. But really an area of ecological and biodiversity that's quite important to the world. The rainforests, for instance, that we'll talk about in just a moment. So those are what we call Middle and South America. Now, the physical geography of this region is characterized in 2 forms in the textbook, that being the highlands and the lowlands. First up would be the highlands, which are typically western landforms. As I talked about, the Sierra Madres in Mexico, western portion of the country. The Andes Mountains, the western portion of the continent of South America. And that follows suit with the mountain chains that follow the entire western portion of North and South America. We have our Rocky Mountains that go through Canada and the United States that follow through into the Sierra Madres of Mexico, down into highlands throughout Central America, and into the Andes Mountains in South America. So these mountains are a massive chain that go the entire realm of the Western Hemisphere and the western portion of the country. And this is an, again, area I talked about because where all the action happens is the subduction zone, where the plate movement, plate tectonics are sliding in, and one has to, by force, move underneath one or the other. And in this case, multiple plates moving underneath each other, creating these massive, massive mountains and activity that you see here with earthquakes, volcanic activity, and large mountain chains. Pictured there are the Sierra Madres in Mexico, followed by the Andes Mountains in Chile. Now brings us to the lowlands, and these are east of the western mountain chains, and these areas of great biodiversity, a variety of life forms found in that given region, a lot of ecological significance to the world in the sense that they're rich in plants and animal species alike. Pictured here are the islands of the Bocas del Toro off the coast of Panama, and the Amazon basin here in Brazil. And you can see these are low-lying areas. That's not to say that some of these areas, because a variety of factors, do have mountains. Islands in the Caribbean are mountainous. An example of Haiti is a good example. Of course, other mountains throughout the Caribbean, and again, highlands in the eastern parts of this region. But the main large mountains dominated in the western portion, just like what we saw in the United States and Canada. If you remember our talk and discussion of the Köppen climate system, Köppen climate system here again characterized by a few different climate types that dominate this region as well. The tropical rainforest, AF, we remember AF, the region being hot and wet AF, and that's an area that typically dominates the region of the equator. And just like following suit here, that darkest blue is following the track of the equator that runs through the region. If you remember, that red, like we saw in North America, was characterized by BWH, which was those hot, dry deserts. And we can see that in the areas of Mexico and along the Andes Mountains. And then we could see the cold, dry deserts, and that would be the BWK. And you could see that follows the sense of northern Chile, where the Atacama Desert is, because there's a rain shadow there due to the Andes Mountains and the wind patterns. And we talked about rain shadows, which leaves an area very dry on the opposite end of the mountain. And that's rich in that sense there. And we can just see the tropical savanna and tropical monsoons. Tropical monsoon also correlating with the wind patterns of the region, and tropical savanna rather, that dominates much of Brazil and other parts of the region. If you remember the American Southeast, areas like Florida, the humid subtropical climate, you'd see in southeast Brazil and parts of northeastern Argentina, and that would be similar to what we would experience down here in Florida. Now this, of course, has an impact on what kind of agriculture could be produced in the region. And it's no surprise that when colonization or colonials settled the area, this was for agricultural purposes. These were for things, well, they were in search of other things, of course, but when they established agriculture in the region, they were growing things that they couldn't acquire in Europe because of, again, geography and ideas that some of these things weren't available yet in Europe, and more on that in just a moment. But in the sense that the geography of this area and the elevation characterized the type of agriculture that could be completed. And so there was these main areas that go up in terms of elevation, where we have the Tierra Caliente, the Tierra Templada, and the Tierra Fria, where the agriculture is situated in this region. You have your tropical production of tropical fruits in the Tierra Caliente before you move into what would be the Tierra Templada, or a more temperate region, so Caliente being the hot region that would be in the most lowland of areas, typically speaking, before the temperate area of the Tierra Templada, where coffee is being produced in a slightly more mountainous area, and you could see that characterizing between 1,000 to 2,000 meters at this point. And then maize, something very important, maize native to the Americas, that eventually became very important to Europe, found in this region before you move up into the cooler areas, which would be wheat, barley, and potatoes. Now again, this climate, the precipitation in this region is influenced by global wind patterns because of its proximity to the equator and its geographic positioning on the Earth. Now the trade winds are something that I talk about slightly more in the lectures as we continue on, but these are winds that blow from the directions of northeast and southeast toward the equator. And again, very important when we're talking about a region that does sit on the equator, like Central and South America, and particularly South America. But these areas like trade winds and El Nino and La Nina are areas that influence far beyond just the immediate countries that are situated in line with the equator. Now, El Nino and La Nina are climate-altering changes, especially in circulation in the Pacific Ocean, and they operate on a global scale, as I just mentioned, that these rippling effects from this area have global consequences in terms of cooling and warming during different periods of El Nino or La Nina. And the environment of this region is dominated by extractive properties in the past, and we're moving on into different economic phases as we speak, but they were very harmful to the to the ecological aspect of this region, as you could imagine. So we know deforestation is an issue in the United States and Canada, but now we know that it's a major a problem, it's a major barrier, and that in Middle and South America. It's been one since the 1970s in this region, because 50% of the remaining rainforests on Earth remain in this region particularly, and so the global community has put a bit of a stop of the destruction of the rainforest. And so extractive practices have continued to harm the environment. This is because soybean production has increased in the region for animal feed. We've seen sugarcane for ethanol purposes, notably in Brazil, among other places, in sugarcane production. Beef for the American fast food industry, or the American food industry, has been the culprit of why, or responsible rather, for why this area has lost so much forest cover. But that's certainly had different impacts. Speaking here in the Brazil example with some of the ranching that's done for beef cattle, but we'll talk about deforestation in terms of Haiti later on in the presentation, something that they have not been able to come back for, and you can see stark differences even looking at the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Clearly see differences in forestry practices. If the current rate would continue, however, all natural forest cover in this area would be gone within 20 years, and the book does a great job illustrating that through some images in the book. But as this area continues to contribute to anthropogenic or human-induced climate change, this region becomes increasingly vulnerable to itself, in the sense that glacial melting is causing an increasingly, glacial melting paired with droughts is feeding to the lack of fresh water available to the people in this region. And so when you have a lack of fresh water, it also trickles into something else on the water end, would be rising sea levels due to the widespread melting of glacial ice around the poles and around the world. And so when you have this when you have the glacial melting that's happening in the Andes Mountains, reducing the amount of fresh water that's happening in the continent, and these people need, of course, the fresh water from the Andes Mountains to fill in areas like the Amazon Basin, and to have areas that could have free and potable drinking water. And it should be said here that also the idea of storm frequency and the idea of storms that are becoming more severe through this area due to wind patterns and ocean currents. This area, particularly Central America and the Caribbean, are prone to hurricanes, and so becoming increasingly vulnerable in that sense as well. It should also be noted that places like Brazil especially has cut the reduction. They've made a claim where they say, okay, listen up, this is something that we're going to just explain in real terms, where they say we're going to reduce the level of forestry that's taking place, the idea of deforestation. We're going to try to reduce the speed of that because they are aware of the ecological consequences and greenhouse gas emissions, and until their economy slowed, that actually worked. They cut their greenhouse gas emissions by 39% for a while, and it was actually quite successful. Now when the economy slowed, there was pressure to go back into those extractive industries, to go back and deforest area for palm oil production, for ethanol, sugarcane. And so now we'll have to see what kind of decisions the countries like Brazil make in the wake of slowing economies. The alternative to these extractive economic endeavors like deforestation for agricultural production would be ecotourism, and that's nature-oriented vacations, usually by affluent people from affluent countries, but not necessarily all the case, but where they're taking them in doing things like zip lining, nature walks, scuba diving, swimming with fish here in this image. And this is an area, countries like Ecuador with the Galapagos Islands off their coast, countries like Costa Rica have really found a way to have a niche on the market here, where they've, their tourism market is designed around promoting their natural environment that they're so lucky to have in that particular sense. And so it's a great money-making scheme. It's when you bet on your land in the sense that you don't have to do much to it, but it also comes at the cost of too much tourism can in fact have a harmful effect on the local plants and animals, and we're seeing that in the Galapagos Islands, the high foot traffic there, and so the travel restrictions are being in place for establishing quotas. Only so many people can travel there per year to try to limit the negative impacts that even ecotourism could bring to the environment. Now, the water crisis, I touched on this not too eloquently, to be honest, so we try to shore that up right now. But this area experiences a ton of rainfall. So what's the problem? If the area has plenty of water, 3 out of the 6 biggest rivers in terms of volume in this region, a lot of rainfall, a lot of ice melting from the Andes, so what's the issue? And that would be these causes outlined here. The climate change would be that fresh water melting that's not going to come back. That would be one issue. Poor planning, that would be another. Planning, not even poor planning, but planning of lack thereof in its entirety. When you have urban growth in the sense where people are setting up shanty towns or slums or favelas in the case of Brazil, these are not planned by a municipality or government in any sense. So what you're seeing here is there is no sewage system, no running water whatsoever, and so when you have no planning, there is going to be no freely and sustainable access to potable or drinking water, potable water, and so you have to rely on barrels and rainwater collection, or going to streams and bringing it in, and so this isn't this around-the-clock access to water or fresh water that you would see elsewhere. When you do have times of fluctuations in weather, it could be problematic for particular areas, and so because of the water infrastructure or lack thereof, with both that and planning, you don't see water being freely available to particular communities, particularly poor communities and vulnerable communities. Sort of the last up on this idea of the environment and the physical geography and how that shaped the region would be the idea of the Columbian Exchange. It comes from Christopher Columbus's 1492 expedition, where he discovered the New World. I put discovered in air quotes because how can you discover something that already had tons of people living and thriving on the land? So he didn't really discover it, he discovered it from a European perspective. However, the land was already well taken care of by its inhabitants of indigenous peoples, people that have been here long before the Europeans. And so this idea was the exchange of plants, animals, ideas, technology, unfortunately negative things too, like disease, between the Americas and Europe as a result of European exploration and colonization of the area. And so things that were so important to the Americas was never known or never widely known of in Europe until this time. Things like the potato, which we would associate with Ireland, right? I mean, the potato famine and the large famine, the potato industry in Ireland and Eastern Europe, other parts of Europe, the potato became quite a staple of their diet, native to the area we would believe is Peru and Bolivia. And so it's an American, it's a New World, it's a plant of the Americas. Things like the tomato, peppers, peanuts, corn, beans, vanilla, coca, these all types of plants that came from the New World, came from the Americas, that we finally exposed the rest of the world to through European colonization. Now they did bring things that, again, were not native to the Americas, and unfortunately some of those things like technology and disease weren't always for the better, because disease did in fact kill lots of people on both ends, new and old world diseases combined. I encourage you to watch this short video, the Columbian Exchange, to really hit home this. Again, these videos do a much better job than my videos, perhaps on particular issues like this. So it's a very popular video, so take a look at that, and really shows how this early idea of colonization, or what we would now consider globalization, making the world smaller through interconnectedness, has really changed things. The potato, from a New World crop to that of Europe, becomes a major staple of Europe, And now we see that 37%, almost 40% of the world's potatoes come from China and India alone. Something that we really wouldn't probably guess or know, but there's your fun fact for the video lecture, that now potato industry has shifted even farther east in that sense. So that wraps up our first part of Middle and South America, part 1, and stay tuned and get ready for part 2.